Okay, so we have to talk about a few things first. One is the importance of building good friendships, because Scott Stevenson didn't tell the most memorable moment of our relationship together, which when I was a project leader and he was a partner, and I was driving us to a client meeting, and I had my first and only accident on the road because I was trying to help Scott plug in his mobile phone while I was driving the car, and we were late to a client meeting. So of all the things he could have told you, he left out the one that was one of the most embarrassing moments of my entire career. So that was very kind of him. The second thing I want to say is that it is an absolute privilege for me to be here with you tonight. My relationship with Erie is 40 years old. My dad moved here in 1981, I think it was. And I grew up in Pittsburgh, and that's where he grew up. But since he moved here, I've come here many, many times over the years. And I've just, through him, through Mary Ellen, through the whole Dahlkemper family, which is a very large one I've learned over the years, I've had a chance to just experience what a special community this is. And I've been hearing for many, many years specifically about this discussion series that's hosted every year. And the chance to actually be on stage sharing some thoughts with all of you is something that I deeply, deeply appreciate. And this community, which has provided the wedding ring that I'm wearing, this is actually the second one. The first one's in the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean somewhere from Dahlkemper's. The engagement ring my son just gave his fiance like a few months ago. So this is like a big part of my life. And then just as a final note, I'm rummaging through my closet because I'm taking my son to the Steelers game on Sunday, which by the way was not the best idea. Horrible rain, horrible performance. And I cannot find my terrible towel, which is probably the reason they lost the game. Had I found the towel, they would have started. But what I did find was my Seawolves baseball cap. So I somehow, I couldn't find anything. Right, so now I get to be here sharing some thoughts with all of you. I'd much rather always have a conversation than just, present. But I did think some background perspectives to feed that conversation would be helpful, and that's what I want to do now. And then when you get to the Q&A part, the only thing I would say is my dad's unable to be here tonight, but I can assure you that he would have one request of all of you, which is that when we do get to the discussion part of tonight, to ask the most challenging questions you can ask, because if he were here, he would certainly be doing that, whether it was me or anybody else on stage. Okay, so let's dig in. I just want to provide a little bit of backdrop. We're really living in a very extraordinary time right now, and I think it's easy to forget just at the exact same time how much change and how much uncertainty we're dealing with. And they're not the same. Change normally is, long-term trends that you have to respond to. Uncertainty are near-term pressures that often cause you to freeze, to not want to do anything, to hunker down just to get through it. And yet right now we're dealing with a lot of both. We have core megatrends going on right now in terms of climate change, which we'll talk about, the changing of the overall economy and demographics of the world with the rise of the global south, with challenges around a multi-stakeholder world that businesses are confronted with, and not just thinking about shareholders, but their employees, their communities, their customers, and how they navigate that. We're dealing with a world of disruptive technology. We'll talk about AI tonight, but we have a lot of technologies that are coming actually at us very, very fast right now. And we have just the uncertainties of all of the wild cards. We've just recently had to deal with a pandemic. We have to deal with a refugee crisis that's only going to get worse, partly driven by climate change. We've had multiple conflicts, one that started a year and a half ago in Ukraine, and now one that is just depressing and terrifying that is happening in the Middle East right now, starting with the terrorist attack a few weeks ago. And so through all of that, the pressures that are on all of us, whether we're businesses or individuals or communities, of how to navigate a world of change and uncertainty is enormously difficult. And I see leaders struggling with that all of the time, of what they do to navigate those combinations of challenges. And so tonight, I was going to suggest we focus on three themes. One, there are many megatrends we could talk about. The one that's most pressing for humanity and for nature is how we address climate. And so I'm going to spend some time on that, not because it's the only one, but it's probably the most fundamental one. Technology, again, there are many elements to that right now, but I think AI is the one we read the most about, and it's the most broad-based. Many of the other technologies are for one industry or one area of the economy, but AI is going to touch pretty much everything. And so I thought and then finally, just a few thoughts on building resilience more generally. I'm not going to spend much time on that, but it may tee up some interesting questions or thoughts from all of you. So I'm going to dig in. So we'll start on climate and sustainability. I just want to put one placeholder first as we get into this. One of the things I've had the privilege to observe, but also from the standpoint of BCG, from my firm to try to help accelerate, is a recognition that companies need to rethink how they participate in the world. And for many, many companies, until maybe 5, 6 years ago, the way they tended to think is, well, your business focuses on making money, and then you carve out a little slice and you give that back in the form of some form of corporate social responsibility, funding something in education or the arts or in a particular community. I think increasingly what companies are recognizing is that there's a different mindset to take, which is about combining building shareholder value with driving societal impact. And that actually when you combine shareholder value, societal impact, and corporate longevity, you actually focus on how you integrate your societal responsibilities into your core of your business strategy, rather than treating it as something off to the side that you do to be able to say that you give something back while you just focus your business on making money. And I would not describe this as universal, and we can certainly point to companies that haven't embraced this to the degree that they should. But I would also say that I see so many more companies that when you talk to senior executives, figuring out what it means for them to actually embed this in their strategies is a big part of what they're doing. And the pressures from society, from different communities, from different stakeholder groups to act in this way, I think is quite strong right now, and in my judgment, a very healthy trend, something that we want to promote and to continue. Of course, there are many ways to take that on. If you're a healthcare company, you first and foremost often think about health equity kinds of issues. If you're a company that's working with a certain population, you may think first and foremost about how you serve that community better and find other ways to contribute. But I'd say almost universally for every company, it's how to think about climate. And it's because of one simple chart, actually, in 2 parts. This is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in parts per million for the last 2,000 years. And what you can see is for 1,900 of those 2,000 years, it flatlined at around 250 parts per million carbon dioxide. And we've been on a near vertical rise in the last 100 years or so. And so that we're within just a few years of crossing 430 parts per million, which is when scientists predict that global temperatures will be an average of 1.5 degrees Celsius, or just below 3 degrees Fahrenheit, above what their mean temperatures have been, average temperatures, for a very long period of time. And not so far beyond that will cross the 2-degree threshold. So this isn't something that's theoretical or whatever. This is an urgent thing. And of course, we see it around us, even just in this past year, for the various weather impacts that we're experiencing. Of course, as a consultant, I presented a lot of charts over 35 years. I've never presented one that's 2,000 years old. But even more, I haven't presented one that's 800,000 years old. Because if you draw that exact same chart, but you don't do it over 2,000 years, but you do it over 800,000 years, you see exactly the same thing, except the yellow line at the end is an even more vertical line. And so how we, and by we I mean the collective we, the we across all countries, across all businesses, across all communities, take on this challenge is among the very most pressing challenges facing the world today. And that's really the question I wanted to start with all of you. First, I think we have to put the facts on the table. We're heading in the wrong direction. This is the rise of greenhouse gases that are produced every year. And what you can see is that's growing still. The rate of increase has slowed a little bit, so that's good, but it's still growing at 1.5% a year. If we were to try to stay within the 1.5-degree limits, we need to be on the steepest drop, the line that's dropping at 7% per year. If we say, well, we're willing to take a lot of risks around nature and different communities, and we'll be willing to go up 2 degrees or a little more, then the drops aren't quite as steep, but they're still exactly the opposite path of the path we're on today. And if you look at what are the commitments, these are the NDCs you might read about as we approach COP28, the national commitments that countries have made. It's still it doesn't get us to where we need to, but it's still dramatically different than the path we're on now. Along all major dimensions, progress is insufficient. If you take it from a country point of view, only 35% of countries have a national net zero commitment by 2050. If you look at it from a corporate point of view, less than 20% of companies have aligned themselves in a science-based way with 1.5-degree targets. If you take it from a technology point of view, the good news, I want to start with this is good news, bad news. About half of the technologies we need to get to net zero are today affordable. They don't come at a cost premium to carbon-oriented technologies, but we still have about 45% of the technologies we need that exist. Almost all of them exist, but 45% are not yet cost-effective, and they need massive investments in order to become cost-effective. And we need to be putting about $3 to $4 trillion a year into decarbonizing the global economy, and we're doing about half of that. So on whatever dimension you pick, what countries are doing, what companies are doing, the technologies we need, or the financing we need to make it happen, we're coming up way short of where we need to. There are some causes for optimism, and I'm actually by nature, I'm sure I just didn't sound like it, a quite optimistic person, and I do see some things. I think corporate commitments to science-based targets have been growing dramatically. There's an NGO, a non-governmental organization that the UN and some leading nonprofits established to set the expectations for what it means to be on a climate responsible path. It's called the Science-Based Target Initiative. And the number of companies signing up with science-based targets that they've committed to has been growing at about 65% a year for the past 6 or 7 years. And now we're at right around 6,000 companies. So we are seeing more corporations starting to take this seriously, starting to make commitments, starting to make bigger and bolder investments. Of course, there's tens of thousands of companies. So while this is genuine progress, and many of the leading companies in the world have made substantial commitments, you can also find a lot of companies that have not yet made those commitments. What also gives me cause for optimism as a former engineer is that technology has often outperformed our expectations. I'm sorry, this is the most complicated chart, and I won't do it full justice here, but the bottom line is if you look at the forecasts that were in place for solar, for wind, for batteries, they way underestimated how much capacity we would now be able to put in place, and they way overestimated how much those technologies would cost when those forecasts were first made. So on all of those dimensions, technology has dramatically outperformed what people expected of it. So while I just said to you a few minutes ago that we're still missing 45% of the technologies that we need, I'm actually personally optimistic that we will, if we invest behind them in the ways that we should, we will be able to bring down the cost of those technologies in a way that may exceed the expectations that we have now for newer technologies, for carbon capture technologies, for hydrogen, for many, better than going to the Steeler game on Sunday was what I did at 8 a.m. Sunday morning when I actually got to see an advanced battery technology that an American company had invented, supplemented with technology from MIT, and is able to do absolutely remarkable ways to make some of the battery technologies that only exist in China right now in ways that are cheaper and much less harmful to the environment in their production. So I do believe deeply in the power of technology, but we have to invest massively behind it, which is why the IRA bill that passed a little over a year ago is so important to start to put hundreds of billions of dollars into accelerating these technologies. And then the last thing, which I think is probably the most surprising thing when I talk both to business leaders as well as to broader audiences, is that actually the end price impact of decarbonizing is far less than people expect it to be. So let's take a car, for example. I'm not talking about the driving of a car, electric car versus a combustion engine car, the actual manufacture of the car itself. If you wanted to make a car that was net zero, how much more would it cost to do it? If you had no carbon in the steel, the aluminum, all of that. The answer is it's about $600 more expensive. But that car, on average, costs $30,000. So it's only a 2%. The cost relative to the end price is 2%. That's much, and by the way, we looked at that for fashion, for food, for construction, for electronics, and it was always the same. 2-3% of the end price that the consumer pays would be the cost to go from a very carbon-intensive production process today to the processes we need. So you'd say, well, if it's so easy, why don't we just do that? I mean, we don't want to pay 2 or 3% more, but that doesn't sound so bad. Why don't we just make it happen? But the answer is right now, yes, the end car may only go up 2% in terms of cost, but the steel producer that's selling to the auto company, the cost may go up 20%, and the battery manufacturer may go up 10 or 20 or 30%. And so all those intermediaries have big cost increases. And so if the end producers aren't willing to pay more, it's really not possible. You either need government support, that's what IRA is helping to do, or you need end producers to be willing to work with their supply chains, which they're often not today. So what do we do? I'm only going to do one slide each, and I'm just going to high point it, and we can come back to it in Q&A. One is we need governments to rewrite the rules of what they're doing. We need better national ambitions from countries around the world. We're about 600 gigatons over the next 30 years, overshooting what our carbon budget is. That means we need much bigger goals to do it. By the way, some of you are saying, what exactly is a gigaton? So let me describe a gigaton in the first way I could actually understand it. Think about liquid carbon dioxide. You take carbon dioxide out of the air and you compress it super dense and you turn it into a liquid. Okay, if you filled the Empire State Building with that liquid carbon dioxide, from the first floor to the 101st floor, you'd have stored about a megaton of carbon dioxide. So if you did that about 1,000 times, you'd have a gigaton. So think of 1,000 Empire State Buildings filled with liquid carbon dioxide as 1 gigaton. And we need to take 600 gigatons out of our national commitments, or we will eventually need to take that much out of the air and bury it back in the ground. The Earth has plenty of room to bury that by. It sounds like an enormous amount, but actually the Earth is pretty big. We have plenty of room to bury it, but it is very expensive to pull an atom that's 500 parts per million out of the air, liquefy it, and bury it back in the ground. So it's a cost issue, not a we have no place to put it issue. We need to recognize the price of carbon. First, we need to measure and be more transparent on what's reported, and then we need a price on carbon. That is not necessarily a carbon tax. I know that's where people go first. There are emissions trading systems. There's a carbon border adjustment mechanism that Europe's putting in. There's cap and trade. I'm not here to talk policies or what's the exact right answer, and there may be different answers for different countries or for different sectors of the economy. But if we don't price the externality of the enormous impact that carbon has in the atmosphere, we will not move at the speed we need to do. Third is we need to increase financing and incentives. Government themselves spends hundreds of billions every year. We need them to be buying greener products. We need to do things like IRA to finance early stage technology. Fourth, we need to take on the ability to go much, much faster. The one you read the most about is permitting. Permitting in this country is horribly slow. It's frankly slow in many other countries too. This is not just a US issue. And we need to work on supply chains, and we need to work on skills. And then we need to prepare for more drastic measures. Measures we hope we won't have to do, but we may be forced to do, whether it's technology bans or whether it's geoengineering, where actually try to pretend we're a volcano and put sulfur in the atmosphere to try to cool the earth or cool parts of the earth. None of those are good solutions. None of those are what we want to do. But if we don't make progress on the first four, we need to understand what are the things we might have to do to go further to be able to bring some control. And then businesses have to contribute a lot too. They need to work with their whole supply chains. They need to help their customers move to greener alternatives. We just did a survey over the summer in 30 different consumer sectors. Only about 2 to 9% of consumers are ready to pay more for greener products. They like sustainability, they wish their products were more sustainable, but a small fraction are ready to pay for it, which means if we're going to make the progress we need to have the manufacturers and the companies designing products that have a bundle of attributes that people are ready to pay for, and not expect them just to pay to get a greener product beyond a very small segment. We need to get industries working together more closely. We need to work across industries to accelerate technology. And then we need business to work productively with government to drive to bolder policies, rather than what has sometimes, not always, but sometimes happened, where businesses work to be a restraint on more aggressive government action to take this on. So it's a really big agenda. We'll talk more about it, but I wanted to just give you a sense of how we try to make progress against this in something close to the time frame that we need. I'm going to shift gears, and we'll come back to this, I'm sure, in the Q&A, which is around technology. You've heard the phrase S-curve before, but some of you may be more familiar than others. Basically, an S-curve is most new technologies start out pretty slowly, where the technology may be coming along, but it doesn't seem to have much impact. Then you get into a very high growth phase, and then it starts to plateau. And we've seen this with so many new technologies over many, many decades, and there have been wonderful books written about the whole subject. I'm going to do justice to none of them tonight. But the bottom line is digital, which we started hearing about a decade or so ago, is actually fairly far. Most companies, most institutions have gone fairly far along to try to digitize how some of their processes work, to bring technologies in that they put inside their companies. AI is at a much earlier stage. In fact, this is a dot I moved down the curve at the beginning of this year, because when generative AI, which I'll come to on the next slide, came out, it was clear we were even earlier in the AI journey than many of us had expected us to be. And then finally, there's a whole set of what we would call deep tech, more physical technologies, quantum computing, nanotechnology, synthetic biology, physical chemistry, climate technology, that are even earlier on in their development right now. And so we are at different S-curves. We're not going to talk about technology in general, but I will take a couple minutes on AI. First, you've been hearing about AI for years, and then starting November 30th, a year ago, when OpenAI made its big announcement about ChatGPT, all of a sudden AI exploded into public view. And so I just want to take 1 second and just try to say, it is not like an iPhone 10 to an iPhone 15. So we all know an iPhone 10, had all sorts of good features in it. We really kind of liked it a lot. But if you could jump 3 or 5 generations forward to an iPhone 15, and you say, wow, it does everything the iPhone 10 did, and now it does all this extra stuff too. That is not what we're talking about here. The kind of AI that we had been hearing about, if I use Google as probably the best example, AlphaFold, which won awards for its ability to fold proteins, which was an enormously technically hard discipline. AlphaGo, which beat the world's best Go player, which is a much harder game for an AI machine to learn than chess. That was an example of machine learning technology, neural networks, things like that. Generative AI isn't going to beat a Go, maybe someday, but there's no sign it will beat a Go player. There's no sign it folds proteins. But what it does do is its ability to take unstructured, large amounts of data and make predictions about what should come next in response to a question is extraordinary. So it's not just simply an incremental improvement on OLED AI. It is just a different kind of AI. And in fact, in many cases, there's enormous power when you combine them together. So when you think about machine learning AI, just to make it come to life, many of you probably have a Starbucks app, right? There's a few of you, hands? Okay, a reasonable number of hands. When you get stars, if you do a certain thing, if you buy something in the afternoon, or maybe buy food to go with your drink, and maybe you get 10 stars, or maybe you get 50 stars. So you need a machine learning algorithm to be able to look at all of the behaviors of millions and millions of people and say, what's the most valuable thing to this particular customer that will get them to change their behavior in a way that will cause them to use Starbucks more, and how much reward do I need to get them to do that? That's a machine learning algorithm. fraud detection that maybe Erie Insurance uses, or maybe a bank uses, or someone else uses. That's often like a machine learning algorithm. The ability to run the airport ground operations at Hartsfield Airport in Atlanta, or Heathrow, those are machine learning algorithms that take millions of data, run them through neural networks, and predict. Generative AI, on the other hand, is, write a sonnet about climate change, but in the way Shakespeare would write it. And it requires the ability to take thousands of inputs in ways you can't even understand. And I tested it at the beginning of the year, and I was like shocked at like how good it could do some of this stuff that you would never think is possible. Or write a software program that can do X, and it can write software that's not perfect, remarkably good, and getting better incredibly fast. Or be able to have a conversational experience. And the ability to combine the two is enormously powerful. So go back to the biopharmaceutical example. We see companies already, and this is less than a year in, that are using generative AI to generate creative new protein structures that could actually address a particular disease area, and then run them through their predictive AI tools to evaluate those proteins and say, which are more likely to work or not, which are more likely to have safety issues or not, and then be able to feed that back in to make the generative AI even better over time. We see it, I'll use an insurance example, forgive me, but we see it in insurance, where the ability to understand, because maybe just a couple of you have experienced insurance reps that weren't as helpful as they might be, but insurance companies want to spot who are the really unhappy customers. And so you can develop predictive AI tools, but it's using very structured data. What you'd really like is to be able to read a call transcript or listen to the tone of voice of a customer and know who's unhappy. And generative AI combined with predictive AI can help spot unhappy customers and intervene earlier. And so you can do some super powerful things to help when you combine the technologies together. And so that opens up a world of possibility. It also opens up challenges, because of course technology can be misused as well. And so like every technology, there can be a force for good, better health, better education, better customer service experiences, many things. It can also have risk associated with it. I also just want to highlight, there's so much focus on the technologies that we lose sight of the people element, but what we see over and over again in working with organizations is that the people side is enormously important. And that in fact, when we are doing work with our clients, whether they're private sector companies or governments, we would say about 10% of the work is like picking the algorithms. Other than, say, the Googles or the Microsofts or the Amazons, most of the algorithms most companies need are already technology available algorithms. About 20% of the work is building the digital and data platforms that to be able to get the data in the right form, be able to use it. But actually 70% of the work is in the people and upskilling and reskilling people and processes. And how should the organization really take advantage of this? How do you build a responsible AI element around all of this to ensure there's not hidden bias, to ensure that it's not hallucinating, to use the word of the year as it relates to generative AI, to assume that as you're actually using it, hidden issues don't creep up that you need to spot and fix. And so those people and process layers are unbelievably important, as important and frankly often more difficult to put in place than just the algorithms and the data platforms themselves. And so if we look at generative AI and you say, well, what does it mean for work? Octopus is an energy company. It's like it helps customers choose utilities and optimize their energy flows. They're using it to sort of automate a lot of their code production. JP Morgan is using it to review their commercial loan agreements. Walmart is trying to use it to bring that into negotiations with its vendors. GitHub is a code writing platform. They're using it to sort of augment code generation to help software writers become much more efficient. We're talking about enormous impacts, and we're very early on in this journey. But what I would say, and I was just talking to my colleagues in the last week about this, most of what we're seeing right now is not get rid of all the workers, just have the machine do it. It's actually to deal with places where workers are not as trained as well as they could be to help them become more productive. Dealing with backlog issues, where there are these enormous backlog issues. Helping address issues where people can get rid of some of the most drudgery part of their jobs and be working on the most value-added elements. So I'm not saying that at some point some job classes won't go away, but I am saying that in many, many cases, more than we expect, I think this will be an opportunity to make for better work experiences, to build more skills in workforce, but it does require a workforce that's ready to learn and to evolve, and requires enormous investment from companies to help them have the skills to be competitive in the years to come. And then just 2 thoughts on resilience, and then we'll go to the conversation. So when we talk about stable times, it's always about optimization. When you get into dynamic times, resilience comes much more to the fore. We have been living in extraordinarily dynamic times, starting with the pandemic, but in many other ways as well. And so resilience is much more the topic of today. So just quickly, because I think it applies personally too, not just even in a corporate setting, what is resilience? Resilience is 4 things. It's thinking ahead of where things could go wrong and thinking about what you would do in different circumstances. That's the ability to anticipate a shock before it happens. It's how you absorb that shock when it first happens. How big a hit do you take to absorb that shock? It's how fast do you adapt to get on a better trajectory after a shock occurs? And then it's in a new world, in a post-shock world, how do you reimagine how you're going to operate? And those 4 capabilities, anticipate, absorb, adapt, and reimagine, are the essence of what it means to build a resilient organization. And I think what we had in most of the teens, the decade that was before this one, most companies saw a relatively stable world. I mean, not politically stable. We all saw the ups and downs and all the debates. But from an economic point of view, it was a more stable environment. So people just focused on optimizing. What's the least amount of inventory I can have? What's the thinnest margins I can operate? I think what we're seeing right now is that companies realize these uncertainties are enormous and they're not going away anytime soon. And there's much more focus on these 4 elements for a very uncertain world looking ahead. And then just as a living example, because he is still living, of the best at this, it's Warren Buffett. None of us can be Warren Buffett, but I just think this stat is the most shocking stat I had heard earlier this year. So Warren Buffett, over 25 years, outperforms the market as an investor by 2 points a year. 2 points doesn't sound like much, but if you're in the investing world, if you can do it every year for 25 years in a row, it's actually a hell of a lot of incremental value creation. But if you look at Warren Buffett's performance, when times are good, he actually underperforms markets by like 7 points a year annualized. But when times are bad, he outperforms by 61 points on average. And every one of those difficult periods is on this chart, and in only one of them, the red one, did he underperform in a bad market. Every other one, he substantially outperformed in a bad market. And to me, that he has a quote that I've often used, or not often used, but I've used sometimes, which is, be fearful when others are greedy, and be greedy when others are fearful. And it's easy to say, and it's extremely hard to live, as any of us knows in our own personal investing. And I think that sort of mindset of trying to think against the grain and trying to be prepared for more difficult periods is good for investing, but it's also good in our lives and in our businesses as well. So another one of my favorite people is Edna Mode from The Incredibles, and she talked about how luck favors the prepared. And I think that's a lot of the world we're living in right now. It's like, how do we prepare for a very challenging and uncertain world, whether it's in climate, whether it's in AI, or whether it's in our overall approach to resilience. So that's what I wanted to share to get us started, and now I'm really looking forward to talking about whatever you're interested in. Thank you.
I know you said there's no other Warren Buffett, but there's no other Rich Lesser. How about another round of applause for Mr. Rich Lesser here tonight? So, folks, I haven't had the chance to meet you. My name is Ben Spag, and I'm the Vice President at the JES, and I'm going to be guiding some of our conversation here tonight. Our conversation means that includes you. So we're going to be looking to take questions from you, the audience. We already know the task. Ask tough questions. That's what Rich's dad would want you to do. I'm going to add a second task, great penmanship, so I can read those tough questions. So we'll get through as many as we can. Rich, wow, thank you so much, so fast. Let's dive in. We're sitting here on a college campus having this discussion here tonight, so I can't help but wonder the role, and let's go to AI first, and then climate change, the role that universities play in preparing students, either perhaps to be thinking about AI or actively engaged in the workforce around AI. What are successful universities doing in the AI space? And then let's talk climate change.
So there's a couple of things I'd highlight, but there's a big one I'll get to in a sec. I think obviously we need every college grad today to have a comfort with technology. It is so much a part of our lives, and as I said, I just touched on the AI part of it because it's the part that touches all of us. But I could just as easily have talked about nanotechnology or quantum computing or the physical sciences. We're just going to see a wave of unprecedented technologies, both software oriented and data oriented as well as physically oriented. And I think universities have a critical role, and I'm not, of course, obviously that's true for the engineering students or the STEM students, but I think there's an opportunity to give every student a comfort to live in a world, whether they're planning to write screenplays, as my niece who's living with us right now wants to do, or be an engineer or a business person or a teacher, to have a comfort with that. I think second, we have to educate responsible citizens right now. And I think we're seeing it over and over. And again, I used climate as an illustration, but it's not just about climate. We need students to have a civic education, to understand why our democracy is something we need to prize and invest in, not just collectively, but as individuals. We need to understand what it means to be a responsible steward of this world that we're living in. And so there's an incredibly important responsibility that universities have to do that. But then the third one, and maybe the most important, though those are both quite important, is I would say learning how to learn will be the defining skill for successful people. A lot of what learning used to be is how much you come out knowing, what you can memorize, how much information you've managed to cram into yourself. But the honest truth is, in today's world, no human can compete with how much they know with what machines know, because they know everything and it's instantly accessible. And that was true before a generative AI world, but that just brings it to life even more. But what we can teach young people to do is how to go into new settings and learn and grow, and ideally not just do it as individuals, but I have collaborative experiences where they work with others and they work with machines to be able to do that. And I think this skill of teaching young people how to learn and to have the comfort that their journey, whether they go into business or government or academia or whatever or just work on a factory floor, whatever paths they take for themselves, they will have to relearn their job over and over and over again, and they have to see that as part of the joy of life, not as a burden. Oh, I learned everything I need to learn, now I just go do something. And I think that's going to be really critical.
So I think that really speaks to the people element of what you were talking about in your presentation. What do we do about the mid-range workers who aren't in the education space right now, who may be phased out? You had a great slide there about workforce reduction versus workforce productivity. What lessons from the past might we have learned? Perhaps coal phase out, what we're doing with miners. How do we get people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s re-skilled and employed in new technology?
So first, I just want to remind us of the optimistic part. A decade ago, everybody thought when digital came along, everybody would be unemployed. I must have done 3 sessions at the World Economic Forum that all started with the premise, a digital wave is on us, everybody's going to be unemployed, talk about that. And it's like, that was like the starting view. But here we are 10 years into a digital revolution, and we're at 3.8% unemployment here, and a dramatically improved unemployment picture pretty much everywhere other than China right now, which is dealing with a whole different set of issues that are not technology related. And so actually the cynics who believe digital was just going to hurt people have been proven completely wrong. And in fact, we just did a survey before Gen AI, it's not a generative AI comment, about how companies have embraced technology, and the companies that have done the best job embracing technology have the happiest workforces. They have workforces where people believe they're investing in their skills, where their jobs are more interesting, where the most repetitive parts of their jobs have been removed, where they get to collaborate with colleagues in different ways. Their Glassdoor is the survey that probably some of you are familiar with, where people put in, they rank their companies. For the companies that have scored best in how they've adopted technology, their Glassdoor rankings are dramatically higher than others. So we first shouldn't start with sort of the negative, it's only going to be evil. There will be a lot of new opportunities and ways to make jobs better. But to your point, and we would say even more with generative AI than with machine learning and other AI, there's going to be a massive reskilling required, because more than even with digital, there will be certain types of job tasks that go away relatively quickly, and it will be really incumbent on companies to find ways to reskill workers, to make them able to take on different kinds of roles in companies, to prepare them for the kind of jobs and the kinds of needs that will exist in a world where you're combining with technology in different ways. And I think that's incumbent on individuals to take some accountability for that, but it's also incumbent on companies to do that. And then just a final point, we focused a lot on, AI, but the investment in physical infrastructure that this country is making right now is absolutely extraordinary. Whether you look at the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, IRA, we will need massive amounts of workers who can work in physical settings to be able to do, and they will need some different skills to be able to do that to the optimal ability we need. But I think we're just underestimating the likelihood of a really serious worker shortage to deal with the huge amounts of investment that we're putting forward over the next decade into our economy in a way that government has never supported in the past. And we'll see how it plays out. Hopefully it won't be inflationary. I mean, there's risks and so forth. I think overall it has more upside than downside potential.
Well, and because you brought it up, I'll ask it now. I wonder if this is where we're going to see a job migration to places like Columbus, Ohio, or Syracuse, New York, with the investment in communities that are going to be just changed in seismic ways overnight. What are you sensing in terms of the moment we're in, which people use the word like unprecedented when it comes to the fire hose of federal funding that's being pumped into communities that it stands the potential to change them overnight?
Yeah, so I was with the CEO of Micron, which is one of the top 3 producers of memory chips in the world. So it's a huge company. The investment they plan to make in Syracuse, New York, so not so far from here, they expect to be the biggest investment in a factory in the history of the United States. Not the history of the tech industry, the history of the United States. $30–40 billion of investment just into this one physical facility. And the infrastructure they need around that facility, they think could get close to $100 billion. So obviously that isn't in the ground yet. I'm not saying it's a done deal. They would say it's not a done deal. And by the way, the government will help, but the government will help a tiny fraction of it. I don't want people to leave here thinking the government's paying for all this. The government's trying to provide seed capital and trying to provide assurances that there'll be markets for those products at the other end. But this will vast majority be private sector investment. That's going to open up an enormous number of new kinds of jobs, new skills. I think whether it's in Columbus where Intel's doing it, whether it's in Syracuse where Micron's doing it, I think that what's going in the ground in the decades ahead opens up enormous potential for young people, but also for more experienced workers to find good jobs and to have opportunities. And again, like in the past, people will migrate to where the opportunities are. I'm hopeful that this will open up a lot of great jobs, in multiple parts of the country. Arizona will be another place. It's not just here.
So I appreciate your optimism, being hopeful. Do you find that you are more optimistic and more hopeful now, in a sense that your optimism has grown over the years you've been involved in this, or have you always just been this optimistic when approaching it? Because it's refreshing. I appreciate it. So are you getting more
Well, I'm
optimistic over
giving
time?
a little bit more of an economic talk than a politically oriented one. And so I think there's lots of reasons to be concerned at the enormous division in this country. And I mean, there's a lot of things that I'm really quite concerned about that wasn't the subject. And then when you look around what's going on around the world right now and the, the two wars that are going on and the impacts on many people, or the impacts on climate change as temperatures rise in places where I worry about people's ability to eat, I worry about food systems, I worry about what it'll mean to live, not in Erie, but in other places where heat is extreme. So I don't want to sound optimistic about everything because I don't feel that way. But if you just ask me about the economy, when everybody was saying there was going to be either a horrible inflation or a horrible recession a year and a half ago, I called my chief economist, who's a lot smarter about this stuff than me, because I didn't quite believe it, and he was like compelling on why that was a possibility, but not the most likely scenario. And I look at assuming that all of this legislation isn't overturned in the years ahead, which probably has some political risk. I'm actually really optimistic economically, particularly for the U.S. Energy independent, a well-educated system, great companies who have really great technology. I really am very bullish on the economic elements, but whether we can navigate all the rest, I don't know. Like, it's really hard, and so I don't want to sound overly pessimistic, but it would be as hard to be as optimistic about those other elements.
What's the biggest roadblock? If you had, I sometimes hate the magic wand question, but if you had a magic wand for the tough stuff that you're not bullish on, what would you fix if you had the power to do it?
On climate, I'd fix more collaboration between government and business. Neither can do it without the other. There's no way government can drive $3 trillion into the global economy every year without a vibrant private sector is behind it and committed and realizes this is where the markets of tomorrow on and doing it. On the flip side, if government thinks it can step back and not price the externality of carbon, not fix this ridiculous permitting system we have, not create transparency so that at least the numbers that are put forward are transparent, not shift its own procurement practices so they're not dated in the 1970s but are in the 2020s about its own rules for what it buys and doesn't buy. If government doesn't get its own house in order, then business can't go fast enough. Business will get there because the economics will eventually work. Like, wind and solar now work. Like, you don't need huge amounts of subsidy to wind and solar because in many places it works. So I'm not saying business couldn't eventually get there on its own, but it'll be 2 or 3 decades too late. And in this world, 2 or 3 decades is enormous cost to billions of people's lives and huge amounts of nature in this world, and we can't afford that. So that one's clearer. I think on the other part, I just hope we can migrate to a more positive dynamic where we take on problems together. And I know that sounds very naive to say when we read what we read every day, but if we could do that, I don't believe there's any insurmountable problems, but I do believe the dysfunction is draining of energy. It creates cynicism in society. It makes it harder to believe in ourselves in the way that Americans have often believed themselves, encouraged immigration, welcomed people, tried to make a society that works for everyone. I think that's what weighs on me.
I think part of I don't think it's naive at all, because I think part of what gave me hope was looking at the local level response with climate change. When the U.S. exited the Paris Accord, we had cities that stepped up and signed agreements and worked on it. What does the local level response look like, or the role or impact that local level government can have when it comes to addressing climate change? Their role, if federal government can't do it alone, if businesses can't do it alone, what role do local governments play in a place like Erie, Pennsylvania?
Well, I think first they contribute to an educated citizenry. I think a lot of people don't trust the federal government. In fact, probably the majority, like for whatever side of the equation they're on. I think they often have more faith, people that are closer. We see that all the time now. When people are distant, they tend to come with a lot of distrust. So local communities can do an enormous amount just to educate people, whether it's educate people on their own responsible actions, what they can do in terms of recycling, or dealing with waste products differently, or changing the products that they purchase, and then I think they can do a lot in the education system. Like, I'm amazed how little science education we give young people in our school districts about what's going on. Many young people just live in fear of the future. I mean, if you live in a TikTok, Instagram world and you see the world through that angle, there are just so many negative stories. And some of it's like I was pretty negative a few minutes ago, so I'm not saying there's not some reality in that, but helping young people understand a balanced view of where we are, what we can do. The world is not going to end, but a lot of people are going to suffer, and here's what we can do to make a positive difference. I think there's that. And then, of course, they can put initiatives in place that encourage more environmental responsibility and help people make smart trade offs and know that government's encouraging that and making it easier to do that.
That makes me think of the slide you had about stability in times and then the dynamic times. And to me, I feel like it's hard to escape the never-ending perpetual sense that we're in dynamic times because of an accelerated news cycle, because of social media. How do we better recognize the average citizen? How do we better recognize what is stable, when it is stable, and what to do in those moments to prepare for the dynamic times a bit better, as much as we can?
Well, each of us plays different roles. Sometimes it's in our families, sometimes it's in our communities, sometimes it's in our businesses. I think that, again, people tend to trust people closer to them. And I so worry every headline is a negative headline. It almost doesn't matter. Negative headlines, I guess, get more clicks or more whatever. And so there's such a tendency to take the darkest view on every issue, which often there's some possibility the darkest view will turn out to be true. But it really it concerns me versus creating a view of like, yes, there's a downside here and there's a risk and there's a challenge and things aren't as good as they should be. And now we work together to try to make it better. And so I guess I feel like I spend more time talking to business leaders about this honestly than others, and I talk a lot to business leaders about like part of the reason you live total societal impact is because trust has never been more important for a business and never been so easy to lose when you act irresponsibly. And so you live a total societal impact mindset along with shareholder value. It's not one or the other, it's both, because you want to earn the trust of your employees, of your customers, of your communities, that you are building strategies that will both create value for your owners, but will also create value and impact in the world. And when you do that, you're more resilient, you're more able to navigate uncertain times, and you're more able to earn the trust of society for the times that you'll make mistakes. Because trust me, we all make mistakes. And every business I've worked with has made mistakes. So the challenge is to earn enough trust that when people know that when you've made a mistake, you're going to own up to it, you're going to fix it as best you can, you're going to get better for the next time around. If people don't trust you and you make a mistake, they just assume the worst about you. And we see this in all this data about businesses. If you look at how businesses that were more trusted before recovered when they screwed something up, it is like dramatically faster than companies that were not trusted, where people just see, I told you so. I knew you couldn't trust those folks, and now they've shown me that you can't do it. And so I do think there's things that business leaders can do to invest in earning legitimate trust in ways that will now allow them to navigate the inevitable ups and downs and have more resilient, longer surviving organizations.
So, in the spirit of full transparency and trust, I'll acknowledge that right before this event, you and I both had our phones out and we were looking at this because you were traveling today, but sometimes you're good and you're prepared. Sometimes you're lucky and the timing works. Today, the White House issued an executive order on artificial intelligence.
Yes.
We took about 5, maybe 10 minutes to look through it. Your thoughts on news of the day coming out of the White House on artificial intelligence?
Overall, I really liked it. I'll give you the one part I didn't like too, in just the spirit of being completely candid, but I thought there was a really good emphasis on safety and security. I think it was kind of acknowledging, because they don't have the power to legislate. You can't legislate without Congress. So, and we all know the challenges in, getting things aligned between the House, the Senate, and the White House these days. But I thought it was overall, I read what they said they intend to do. And I think that on that side of things, I thought it was quite good. There was just literally one sentence in the whole thing, so I don't want to overreact to it, but there's one sentence about basically the Federal Trade Commission trying to manage competition in this space. And I must admit, to me, it's very different to want to protect people, to ensure that AI is used responsibly, than to view this as another place where the FTC is going to try to determine which competitors are good competitors and which ones are not. And I don't feel as good about that, and I think there's been a bit of overreach in this administration that's been very frustrating to me. And I think that what I read today made me think they're going to take that into this space. But that was when they got away from the real intent: make it safe, make it secure, make sure privacy issues are respected, avoid biosecurity risks. I mean, a lot of the things they outlined, I thought were the right places to try to work on, and I thought for the things that are within their control, they did a good job with it.
So I appreciate the answer, especially on something we're looking at just moments before we get on stage, news of the day. But great questions from the audience. I appreciate all of your questions. If you still have them, there's still time to write them down. We're going to work to get through as many as we can, starting with one. And I think this is a frustration that many people feel when it comes to actual belief in climate change. This person phrases it: how can we make progress when we have many political leaders who do not believe in climate change? How do you address deniers? How do you have that conversation?
So, so first you kind of have to meet people where they are. In fact, some of our clients, the first session we do with them is bringing a bunch of scientists in and just talking about the science of climate change and trying to do it in a way that is not preaching at people or implying that some people are smart and some people are not smart, but just to have an authentic, honest dialogue about what's really going on. And we felt like some of our clients have moved. Obviously, the politics of climate it's gotten so politicized in a quite shocking way sometimes. I don't know. I mean, IRA was a good bill that was one vote short of becoming a great bill, as I understand it, without going into a lot of details, but I was reasonably close to it at the time. What was passed was really impressive, and we were one vote from having at least some price on carbon. It would have been a very low price, but it would have at least put us on the journey to price the externality. That's a loss. But the rest of the bill, the incentives to adopt lower climate technologies, the investment in new technology is great. I think what Europe is doing is too bureaucratic. I mean, it is Europe after all, and they have many good qualities, but bureaucracy unfortunately sort of comes with the territory. But the intent of some of their climate legislation is quite powerful, and the US will have incentives to collaborate when you look at like how they're going to handle imports and exports. And so there's some opportunities there. I don't know. I mean, I spent a lot of last year before that legislation passed, some combination of stressed and depressed that we wouldn't get anything through, because for many months it looked like, from December when Joe Manchin announced he wasn't going to support original bill, of which climate was only a small part. The end bill, climate was a huge part. In the earlier bill, it was a small part. And when he withdrew his support for that, I was really worried we would get nothing through and the US would just be left behind the rest of the world and be a drag on the world. I don't think that's true right now. In fact, the US, I think, has 300 investments announced to take advantage of IRA in a year, like big investments from many companies, and half of them come from companies outside the US who now realize the US is the best place in the world because of those incentives to invest to build hydrogen capabilities or carbon capture and storage capabilities or other things. So I don't think we should feel bad about we should feel bad about where the planet is, and we should feel bad that we didn't get started on this 20 years earlier, and we've made our lives that much harder as a result. But I do think there's been a positive step forward, and hope one is that step itself doesn't get watered down or removed, with all the uncertainty politically. And then step two is, can we take another step on top of that and another step on top of that, and ideally do it in collaboration with Europe or China, because those are the three. Between those three, we're talking over 50% of global emissions and a part of like probably 90% of global supply chains. So if we could find ways to build collaboration, and I know that seems very distant right now. I don't think it's as distant as people think. I think there's more opportunities there than in almost any other space to try to get some collaboration.
You were in the UK for a meeting when President Biden met with King Charles.
Yes.
And so talk a little bit about what's it like to be in the room with both the president and the king, but then what really does the US-UK relationship around climate change initiative look like? What's the most promising? What do we need to work on?
Yeah, I kind of felt a little weird. Windsor Castle's beautiful. I'd never been to any of this stuff, and I wasn't even quite sure I was there. It was bankers and philanthropists and me and one other person who's like got a huge company. And so I wasn't expecting to be there. Um, I think that I think the US and the UK on this topic are largely aligned. I think the UK started off a bit bolder, but it's been forced to back off. It's in a much tougher place economically than the US. I mean, whereas the US, you can see more upside than downside. The UK, in my view, in good part because of the Brexit decision, but for whatever reason one wants to put on it, is in a challenge place. So I actually think the two countries will largely converge on what they want to do. And I think King Charles, when he was prince, now as king, he's got to be careful not to talk policy. So he can sponsor things, he can be a convener of people, but he cannot personally take the stance he took as prince, where he was extremely bold on topics of climate and nature. And I thought that was the role he tried to play at this session. He wanted to get leaders together to talk about how we, in this case, the particular focus is how do we get more money to the global south? Because there are the honest truth is that in places like the US or Europe or even China, which is still doing coal, but is also doing a ton of renewables, there's all sorts of physical capital going in to decarbonize. In the global south, to put capital in means you need upfront investment. Upfront investment in places that are not viewed as trustworthy investment countries comes with very, very high interest rates, along with higher capital costs due to inflation. And so there's a huge, huge challenge right now of how to get more money to the global south. And that was why they convened this intersection of bankers and philanthropists to try to talk about how we do that. And I thought there's I spend personally more time with Secretary Kerry's team. He's our special envoy for climate than I do with others. And you know, the commitment of the State Department and others to try to help find effective ways to move money to the global south to accelerate decarbonization in tangible, verifiable, impactful ways. I've been so impressed with at a time when, you know, Congress is unlikely to approve anything close to the amount of funding that ideally should go there. So we need to find other ways to do that, and there's a lot of focus on doing that. I think the jury's out on whether it'll be successful.
We've got several audience questions, and I'm going to try to do them justice and lump them together, but they're talking about population increase globally and its impact on climate change. Are there just simply too many of us? We've not caught up. Are we the problem?
I don't. The amount of energy per capita that's consumed in the places that are growing population is very small. Most of the energy is not consumed by the places with lots of people. It's consumed by places like right here that don't have, what are we, 320 on 8 billion. We're 4% of the world's population. We consume a whole lot more than 4% of the world's energy, not just directly, but if you look at the goods we import from China and how much of China's emissions are for goods that come to the US, I mean, we represent a huge share. So, of course, like most people, I wish there was, I mean, most of the world is actually declining in the rate of population growth. And of course, some parts of the world are actually shrinking in population. I think the biggest challenge we have from a population point of view is in Africa right now, where the population is expected to double in a reasonably short period of time. And when you combine that with the fact that it's a continent that literally sits on the equator, has enormous challenges in food system, too much poverty to begin with, I have tremendous concern about what we'll be able to do to get technology to Africa, whether it's better food systems or better energy systems, to help people lead better lives. And that would obviously be easier if there was less population strain. But I don't believe the main challenge for decarbonizing the planet is the population growth disproportionately in Africa. I think it's accelerating the progress in places where there isn't much population growth, whether it's here, Europe, China, or many other parts of the world, but we just have to decarbonize our energy infrastructure as fast as we possibly can.
So back to AI for a second, and this might have come from a student in tonight's audience. Would you be a computer science major right now? Would you have confidence in that as a career?
It's a really good question. I think understanding, if the question is, should you become a software coder, I think much of that job is going to become obsolete over time. Is it worth understanding how technology works, how you build systems, how you combine them with broader processes, to deliver value to people, whether it's in the form of a business or a government. I think there will be enormous needs for numbers of people who understand technology and can support its deployment. But the specific skill of software writing is something that I think will be more and more done by machines. And if I were in school right now in computer science, I would make sure that I develop the most broad-based education of technology and how it's used, and not just think that writing software is going to be how I make my living.
Businesses using virtual reality and augmented reality, fad or future?
Okay, so here I am an optimist. You called me an optimist before, and I wasn't sure I always agreed with it. On this one, I'm an optimist. And in fact, just coincidentally, it turns out that our advanced technology design lab for BCG in North America is in Pittsburgh, which is where I was. And so this morning, we have one of the 10 outside of Apple units of the new Apple AR technology. So I had a chance to wear it. I'd been to Magic Leap a couple times down in Florida, which has the most advanced augmented reality. But anytime Apple takes something on, you know they're going to be like putting a lot of muscle behind it. So I had a chance to wear theirs today. I don't believe it's ready yet. It's too heavy on your face. It doesn't have the features. But I believe when we can get to a world where most computing can be done in the cloud, it's just, even though it seems really fast today, is still too slow, but the next generations won't be too slow, and you can keep reducing the size. I actually have a lot of optimism of augmented reality, but I think my earlier views on timing were too optimistic. And I did this once before when I did mostly healthcare work before I became CEO. And I remember being very optimistic about the power of biotech. And it turns out, I think in retrospect, when you look at what it's yielding, it's correct, but I was way too fast on how quickly it would happen. It took much longer. And I have this sense, augmented reality, if you ask me about the late 20s or 30s, I really believe it'll have impact on businesses, field engineering, it'll have impact on consumers, to see the world, to do other things. I think it will have very big impacts, but I think we need probably one or two more generations of faster bandwidth communication and more powerful computing and lowering cost to get it to a place where it can be broadly used outside of defense departments or places that are basically price insensitive. So I am optimistic, but not in as fast a time frame as I was 3 or 4 years ago.
So an eagle-eyed audience member sees you have a smartwatch on, asking, what is your favorite piece of tech or software you use? What's the favorite analog thing you still use in your life?
I don't use much First, I'm a really boring person. Like, I'm not doing so much of, I drive an electric vehicle and I have an iPhone. I don't know, I live in my phone. My watch is just it'd be easy. My least favorite is the health features of an Apple phone. It tells me, I've had days I've never left my desk and it tells me I met my activity goals for the day or whatever. I could, if I believed my watch, I'd be like a world-class athlete. Like right now, I'd go run a triathlon. I'd leave here, I'd run a triathlon before I went to bed and swim and bicycle and whatever. And so I don't think all the technology is great yet, but it's just so ingrained in my life. And that's why, back to this AI world, I think we forget how dramatic, people are easily able to compare in the same moment in time. Part of the dysfunctions of society is, everybody puts the best version of their lives on Facebook or TikTok or whatever, and we're constantly comparing ourselves to that. And I think particularly for young people who are, just at a less grounded part of their lives, it can be enormously disruptive. But we have almost no ability to remember our lives 10, 20 years ago. I think we do not realize just how much, whether it's, how we consume media or how we connect to each other or how we do sports or do other things. It's so embedded in our lives. So for me, my phone, I'm tethered to it night and day for all of those activities and many more, and some work better, some work worse.
Here we're looking at two different questions about disparity on AI and climate change. One looks at how climate change impacts individuals differently across socioeconomic, location, and other factors.
Totally.
What's most pronounced to you? And the other's talking about AI in terms of facial recognition, information data that we teach, that it's biased. So comments on both when it comes to disparities. Climate change for individual socioeconomic
I'm
status.
terrified about the people who live in high heat parts of the world. South Asia, whether it's India or Southeast Asia, parts of Africa, parts of Central America. I'm terrified for them. I'm terrified what life means when temperatures go up at a reasonable rate. I'm terrified about what it means for food systems. Those are often, let's take out Singapore out of that mix and a couple other cities in the Middle East. On average, these are lower to lower middle income parts of the world. And I look at the lives and the strains that people feel, and then you add water stress into that and other things. So there are many other disparities, because it's true even in wealthier communities, the disparities across income of how people's lives are affected due to climate stress is meaningful. And so I'm not trying to say that's the only thing, but if you ask me what's the disparity I'm most concerned about, it's what it's going to be like for hundreds of millions of people that are living on the edge already, and now is going to be subjected to these really cruel living conditions for a more meaningful part of the year. On the AI topic, I'm probably more optimistic there. Trust me, we did a great report with Microsoft at the end of last year about responsible AI, even before the generative AI came out. Our CEO, I had as CEO said there would be two topics we would speak about publicly in a very bold and direct way. One was diversity, equity, and inclusion, and one was climate and sustainability. And he added, when he became CEO, responsible AI would be the third. So I think it's incredibly important. But I actually think the technologies and tools to test for bias, to look for second order contrast, to go back and analyze systems and how they've actually worked so you can spot issues. I think it's much more about intent and good governance than it is that the technologies themselves are uncontrollable. I think it's more the risk of technology in the hands of bad actors, and what bad actors would do with deep fakes or synthetic biology or whatever. Like, I can give you lots of harms that AI could produce, but bias to me is one of the most direct to address. It just requires good intent and really good governance with the technical systems around it to do the evaluation. So that one I'm a bit more optimistic on than some of the other ways that these things could be misused.
So Rich, we're almost out of time. So I'm going to ask one last question, and before I do that, I do just want to take a moment to thank you. I'm going to ask folks to hold their applause. We'll have a big round of applause at the end. I promise. I'm going to be the first one clapping, because Rich, this was just so great. Really insightful. We are so appreciative. I know the Erie community is certainly better for having had you here tonight.
Thank
and
you.
Hopefully we can bring you back again soon, because we didn't get to talk about politics. You mentioned that earlier. So I got you on the hook.
You've got so many great speakers come to talk politics. Use them. That's totally fine.
So we'll get you back as soon as we can. But of course, Dr. Ferrati from the JES mentioned it earlier. This doesn't happen without our sponsors. So again, a huge thanks to all of our sponsors, the many, many sponsors that make this entire series happen, including tonight's sponsor, Erie Insurance, with the leadership of Tim DeCastro and Chris Marsh and the entire team there. We are just grateful for what they're doing for the community, for what they do with us in partnering with the think tank and empowering the work we do, and so many other organizations that they help throughout the community. And of course, thank all of you. This wouldn't happen if you weren't in the room, shoulder to shoulder, experiencing this, asking great questions, taking this with you at the end of the night, and of course, coming back to other programs. We're right back here tomorrow night with Richard Reeves. We're back here on Wednesday night with Della Clark. We're back here Thursday night with Tom Nichols. And of course, that's just week 2. There's week 3. More information on our website, jeserie.org. As folks come out here, they listen to you, Rich, and
went through a lot of stuff, like super fast. Don't we give a round of applause to the sponsor?
Thank you. Sometimes I get on a roll, I forget to breathe, and then I just go right
I do
to
that all the time,
questions,
trust me.
so-
That's like my life story, so I can totally relate.
I knew that's why I liked you. Okay, so I mentioned folks come to this and then they head off into the night, and maybe we see folks back here tomorrow, maybe it's a couple programs, maybe it's not until next year. But as they head off into the night, and you covered so much ground tonight, Mr. Richard Lesser, you were talking about climate change, you're talking about artificial intelligence, you're talking about resiliency. As they're having that conversation on the car ride home together, or they call a friend, and they think about tonight and they wake up tomorrow morning, what do you hope is still on their mind in terms of what they're thinking about and what they can do to address any of these issues that we've touched on here tonight?
So, uh, okay, I'll go in backwards order. On resilience, I think that little framework for me about anticipate, adapt, um, uh, you know, respond more quickly, reimagine. I think that's a life framework, not just a business framework. And I think it's worth looking at our lives and thinking about the risks we're facing and just how do we think about that for ourselves, not just if we're in a business, what we do. I think on AI, I guess if you, well, some of you are young people in this room, but many of you are connected through family or community or other ways. I think trying to help people see this as an opportunity and not just a threat, and how do they invest in themselves? How do they invest in their own capabilities? How do they seek to become lifelong learners? And by the way, it's not just young people, as you correctly pointed out, it's even people in the middle of their careers and how they do that. There's such a tendency, and so much of the story is a more fearful one. I think on climate, it's about a resolve. It's a resolve to figure out how each of us, from our own standpoint, makes a difference. How do we step up when we have an organization that we're close to make sure it's setting ambitious goals? How do we encourage our politicians to engage in this in an open way? How do we take a collaborative spirit? Just as a final quick note, so I've been the chief advisor to the Alliance of CO Climate Leaders for the last 4 or 5 years, and every year BCG writes a report as a part of that. And it's normally about what individual companies should do, our 120 some leading companies that are a part of this community. This year, we're writing a very different report. It's the reason I shared those 2 slides when I went through what needs to happen. We believe it's important to take a systems view to this, that no one acting alone can get us there far enough, fast enough. And the only way we make progress is if we collaborate. And if we collaborate not just within the business community or within the public sector, but across them. And I think many people in this room, one way or the other, have connections to say, you know, are we sitting down, if we're businesses, with governments and saying, how do you help us be more ambitious? If it's a government, you know, what can you do to sort of encourage and support businesses to go further, or take on your own procurement or your own permitting processes to be able to accelerate this? I think that we all have to bring that to our mindset, and none of us will feel like we're doing enough because it's such a global problem. But if we don't each step up and try to have impact, we just won't go far enough, fast enough.
One of the great connectors that we are so grateful for making the connection for tonight's program to happen. A round of applause for Mary Ellen Dahlkemper and Ed Lesser. We are just so grateful for all you do for the community and for sharing this gift. Folks, thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, that huge round of applause for Mr. Richard Lesser and the Global Summit.